They can't explain how you did this. And that's the part that keeps replaying in their minds. Not the outcome, the absence of a method. Shifts usually announce themselves through effort, through conflict, through visible escalation. This one didn't. It arrived quietly and changed the atmosphere before anyone could label it. People noticed before they understood. Conversations slowed around you. Familiar reactions stopped landing. The usual signals they rely on to read intent returned nothing useful. And when interpretation fails, attention sharpens. They retraced interactions, searching for a moment where you tipped your hand, a statement, a reaction, a declaration of intent. There wasn't one. You didn't posture. You didn't withdraw. You didn't signal growth. You remained steady, while the environment recalibrated itself around you. That's what made the shift impossible to ignore. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was structural. What changed wasn't your behavior. It was how everything else responded to it. And responses like that don't come from performance. They come from position. Something about where you're operating from stopped inviting influence. Pressure lost traction. Expectations expired. Assumptions dissolved without argument. They didn't feel threatened, they felt displaced. Because when someone stops responding to the usual levers without resistance, it forces a realization no one is prepared for. Whatever moved here didn't move by force. It moved because something underneath it was already complete. What unsettled them wasn't that you changed the outcome. It was that none of the explanations they reached could survive contact with reality. They tried effort first. Maybe you worked harder in silence. That didn't fit. There was no strain, no overcompensation. Then they tried strategy. Maybe you planned this, mapped it out, executed it carefully. That didn't fit either. There was no trace of calculation, no visible setup, no signs of anticipation. Then they tried confidence. Maybe you finally believed in yourself. But belief usually leaks. It seeks confirmation. Yours didn't. You weren't proving anything. You weren't correcting perception. You weren't waiting to be seen. And that absence of need collapsed every familiar explanation. Because most shifts depend on reaction. Yours didn't. You weren't responding faster or slower. You were responding from somewhere they couldn't reach. That's when the questions stopped being about what you did and started being about what changed around you. Why certain behaviors no longer worked. Why familiar dynamics felt obsolete. Why people adjusted without being told to. They noticed how the room recalibrated itself the moment you entered. Not louder, more deliberate. Not tense, more precise. The shift didn't announce power. It eliminated resistance. And when resistance disappears without conflict, people know something fundamental has moved. They just don't know how. That's when a deeper realization started forming. One they didn't want to rush into naming. This wasn't about something you did. It was about something you stopped doing. The constant adjustment, the unconscious negotiation, the micro reactions that keep systems alive. You weren't feeding the loop anymore, and systems fade quietly before they collapse. They noticed you weren't checking the room for permission. You weren't mirroring tone. You weren't timing your words for approval or effect. You spoke when it mattered. You stayed silent when it didn't. And that precision unsettled them more than aggression ever could, because aggression gives shape to opposition. Precision removes it. They realized that whatever leverage they once assumed existed was gone, not taken, removed by absence. That's why nothing escalated. No one challenged you directly. No one pushed harder. They sensed, instinctively, that effort would no longer produce response. When effort yields no response, effort feels wasteful, and waste stops behavior faster than resistance. That's when the shift became impossible to ignore, not because it demanded attention, but because it quietly rewrote the rules everyone else was still playing by. Once that understanding surfaced, everything they used to rely on stopped working at the same time. Not gradually, simultaneously. Their framework depended on predictability, on the idea that people adjust when watched, soften when pressured, explain when questioned. You didn't. And when one person exits that pattern cleanly, it exposes how fragile the pattern actually is. They started replaying old moments with new eyes. Times they assumed you were passive. Times they thought you were waiting. Times they believed you hadn't noticed what was happening. Those interpretations no longer held. What they had read as hesitation was restraint. What they labeled distance was completion. You weren't disengaged. You were finished negotiating. And finished negotiations don't reopen. That's the part that unsettled their certainty. Because once someone steps out of the exchange, there's no move left that reshapes the situation. You didn't block them. You made access irrelevant. The shift didn't feel aggressive. It felt resolved, like a door that closes quietly and leaves no reason to check it again. That's when they stopped trying to explain it and started adjusting to it. Because explanation assumes influence is still possible. Adjustment accepts that it isn't. After that, attention stopped producing insight. Watching you no longer sharpened understanding. If anything, the more they observed, the clearer it became that observation itself, no longer applied. You weren't reacting to being seen. You weren't adjusting under focus. You weren't performing stability or growth. You were simply operating from a place that didn't register attention as input. And when attention loses its effect, people sense it immediately. They hesitated. They slowed down. They stopped trying to figure you out. Because figuring assumes a handle. There wasn't one. You didn't become distant. You became exact. Exactness removes interpretation. It demands clarity. That's why the shift couldn't be ignored. It wasn't loud enough to debate, and not subtle enough to dismiss. It simply sat there, unmistakable. The way outcomes stopped bending. The way timing stopped being flexible. The way interactions simplified. Instead of escalating, you didn't demand respect. You removed dependency. And once dependency is gone, attention loses direction. People stop leaning forward. They begin stepping back. Not out of fear, out of recognition. This is where the questions finally lost momentum. Not because answers appeared, but because the reason for asking disappeared. They realized there was no mechanism left to examine, no pressure point to test, no emotional thread to pull that would produce response. You weren't withholding information. You weren't concealing intent. You simply weren't oriented toward explanation anymore. An explanation only exists inside an exchange. You weren't inside it. That's why conversations about you became quieter and more deliberate. Not speculative, not dramatic, deliberate. People learned that framing you as a problem to solve didn't work. Framing you as a mystery didn't help either. Both assumed access. Both assumed clarity would arrive through effort, and effort had already proven ineffective. What remained was acceptance without announcement, the kind that changes behavior without changing language. They stopped approaching you with agendas, stopped positioning themselves for advantage, stopped assuming familiarity, not because you demanded distance, because distance already existed without being drawn. And distance like that doesn't invite testing, it ends it. They call it overnight because that's when they noticed it, not because that's when it formed. Completion always feels sudden to observers who weren't watching the right thing. You weren't building momentum outward, you were consolidating inward, quietly, consistently. And consolidation doesn't broadcast progress, it concludes. That's why the shift felt impossible to miss once it registered. There was no transition phase to argue with, no early version to compare against, just a before that no longer applied, and an after that didn't need explanation. People don't struggle with change as much as they struggle with unfinished change. Yours wasn't unfinished. It had already settled. That's what made it unmistakable. They didn't witness growth. They recognized a new reference level, and reference levels don't negotiate. What followed wasn't tension. It was restraint. People adjusted the way they spoke around you, the way they timed requests, the way they assumed access, not because you corrected them, but because correction wasn't required. They learned that some positions don't respond to pressure because pressure no longer applies. You didn't harden, you stabilized. And stabilization alters the entire environment. The space became quieter, not heavier, clearer, not tense. Performances fell away because performance needs an audience that reacts. You didn't. The shift didn't make you dominant in appearance. It made dominance unnecessary. And that's why it lingered, because nothing followed it to dilute the effect. What it left behind wasn't confusion, it was accuracy. People recalibrated expectations without discussion. They stopped assuming influence where none existed, stopped mistaking observation for control, stopped waiting for you to revert. They understood, finally, that whatever changed wasn't temporary, wasn't emotional, and wasn't open to interpretation. You didn't change the rules by confronting them. You revealed where the rules no longer applied. And once that point is recognized, behavior adjusts instinctively. That's why no one can explain how you did this, because it wasn't done. It was complete. The shift was impossible to ignore because it didn't ask to be noticed. It simply became the condition everything else adjusted around. And conditions don't announce themselves. They persist. This is where it closes without needing agreement. Not because everyone understands it, but because there's nothing left to test. The environment already adapted. The behaviors already shifted. The assumptions already expired. Curiosity no longer led anywhere useful, because movement stopped producing change. You didn't create a mystery to solve. You revealed a threshold they wouldn't move past. And once a threshold is recognized, effort reorganizes itself automatically. People stop pushing where nothing responds. They stop explaining where explanation has no listener. They stop waiting for reactions that never arrive. What remains is a quiet certainty that doesn't seek validation. You're no longer processed as a situation. You're accounted for as a constant. And constants shape outcomes without conversation. That's why no one can explain how you did this, because nothing happened in the way they understand action. The shift didn't start when they noticed it. It concluded, and conclusions like that don't invite follow-ups. They establish a new reference and move on. The last thing they accept is that nothing is coming to clarify this. No reveal, no confession, no return to an earlier version of you. Whatever they were waiting for already passed without notice. And that's why it holds. They stop expecting movement, because movement would imply incompletion. You aren't incomplete. You're settled. They feel it in how quickly effort now feels unnecessary, how pressure feels misplaced, how assumptions dissolve before forming. You didn't remove yourself from the space. You removed the space's ability to move you. And once that's understood, there's nothing left to pursue. No leverage to recover. No story to finish. They don't talk about it because discussion would imply doubt. There isn't any. They adjust and carry on with a quieter precision than before. That's the closing state. Not admiration, not fear. Alignment, the kind that doesn't need explanation and doesn't reopen. This is where it stays settled, without reinforcement, not frozen, not dramatic, simply resolved. The people around you stop framing moments as tests. They stop waiting for reactions that would confirm old assumptions. They move with an understanding that whatever shifted already completed its work. You didn't signal closure. Closure arrived because there was nothing left to exchange. The shift didn't leave questions behind because questions require assumed access. And access is no longer assumed. What remains is a quiet recalibration beneath language. Decisions become cleaner. Interactions simplify. Expectations narrow to what's real, instead of what's convenient. You didn't change the environment through force. You revealed the point where force stopped mattering. Once that point is recognized, it doesn't need revisiting. This isn't an ending that asks for acknowledgement. It's an ending that removes the need for it. They can't explain how you did this because explanation belongs to a phase that already passed. The shift was impossible to miss because it didn't ask permission to occur. It simply became the condition everything else adapted to. And conditions like that remain. What stays unchanged after all of this is the threshold they now respect without naming. Not because you enforced it, but because reality did. They don't try to reframe the moment anymore. They don't search for angles or alternate explanations. They understand, beneath language, that whatever shifted no longer responds to interpretation. You didn't become unreachable by distance. You became unreachable by influence, and that distinction stays. The shift wasn't dramatic because drama invites response. This didn't. It settled. It integrated. It removed the need for continuation. They accept it the way people accept gravity, by adjusting behavior, not by debating existence. No one can explain how you did this because the idea of doing no longer applies. The shift wasn't created, it was completed. And completion doesn't reopen. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't seek attention again. It simply holds. This is the condition that remains regardless of time. Not because it's defended, but because there's nothing left to challenge. People don't revisit the moment looking for flaws. They already know it holds. The adjustment has been absorbed so fully it feels like it was always this way. That's how real shifts settle. They erase the sense of instability that came before. You didn't leave behind uncertainty. You left behind a line that isn't crossed again. Not out of fear, out of clarity. Whatever you triggered wasn't meant to be examined because it relied on remaining unquestioned. From here on, no one waits for a next phase. No one expects a later explanation. No one assumes the shift was temporary. They've already adjusted their internal map. You are accounted for, not anticipated. That's the deepest consequence. You didn't create curiosity that fades. You created certainty that stabilizes behavior. And stabilized certainty doesn't look dramatic. It looks like silence. Where probing used to be, it looks like restraint. Where pressure once lived. It looks like people moving around a truth they don't need to discuss anymore. Your presence didn't change to announce anything. It changed to remove dependence. And once dependence is gone, nothing pulls you back into old dynamics. That's why this doesn't evolve further. That's why it doesn't escalate. That's why it doesn't need another chapter. Overnight wasn't the beginning. Overnight was simply the moment they noticed the shift had already settled. No echo followed. No reinforcement was needed. People didn't return to old theories because returning would imply uncertainty, and uncertainty no longer applied. What remained was a settled understanding that didn't require language. They knew where not to apply pressure. They knew which assumptions no longer functioned. They understood that whatever shifted in you wasn't accessible through effort, patience, or proximity. And knowledge like that doesn't create drama. It creates restraint. You weren't folded into explanation or narrative. You became a reference others oriented around without comment. That's why the way they watched changed. Not from caution, from accuracy. They recognized that attention wouldn't move you. Pressure wouldn't reveal anything new. Time wouldn't soften you into explanation. You weren't withholding anything. You were already complete before they noticed. And completion ends the need for conclusions. From here on, attempts to reinterpret feel unnecessary, even misplaced. Because everyone senses the same truth beneath the surface. Nothing is waiting to resolve. Nothing is unfinished. Whatever shifted completed its work without spectacle. That's why there's no echo, no sequel, no return to inquiry. The change wasn't an interruption. It was a correction. And corrections don't announce themselves twice. They set the direction and disappear from conversation. This is where it settles. Quiet, stable, decisive. Not because you hold power, but because power no longer needs to move through you to exist. The environment already learned, and learned environments don't ask again. They adjust. And once adjustment replaces reaction, nothing needs to follow.